Hello everyone. You've joined us in our Dunkeld archive and a performance of Echoes from Gallipoli. It's a rehearsed reading with live music, and all proceeds will go to support the archive. In the heart of Dunkeld are treasures from the past accessible with today's technology. Most of this performance was written by Bob Davidson and first successfully performed by Burnham Institute players in association with the Dunkeld Archive, here in Burnham Arts in September 2015. The presentation was part of a commemoration of the Scottish Horse Yeomanry and their part in the Gallipoli campaign during World War I in 1915. We have revisited the script with a new setting, live music and other additional highlights to support the Dunkeld Archive once more. But wait a minute, I'm actually off to the archive now. You can come with me and we can see what we can find out from Ruth, who looks after the archive. Hi Ruth, how are you?
Very well, thanks Mary. How can I help you today?
Well, I'm doing another project for history, and I heard the Gallipoli play on the radio. Could I maybe see some of the material it was based on?
Sure. Bob's main source was Private William Mowat, and as it happens, I've got his box out just now. Yes, here it is. His personal memoir and his attached letters from 1983, offering it to Lieutenant Colonel Lyle, who helped run the Scottish Horse Museum at the time. He wrote the account for his family quite a while after the war, and he lived in Walkmill Cottage in Stormontfield.
And didn't he run the ferry across the Tay to Lumperty until 1964?
Yes, you've certainly done your homework, and he lived until he was over 100 years old. If we look in this book, here's his original entry. And he enlisted, but we can now look him up on Tom.
Tom?
It's short for the Ogilvy Muster. We're now part of a huge project with the Army Museum's Ogilvy Trust. They've digitised over 80 regiments so far, including the Scottish Horse Regiment, and it's online for the public to look for and print the documents and photographs for a small fee.
So, a bit like Scotland's People, that government archive website?
Yes, but it means that the revenue comes directly to the individual regiment, which helps pay for the care of the collection and keeps it in Dunkeld where it belongs. Here he is. He signed up on the 17th of August 1914, right at the start of the war. A volunteer and only 21.
Oh, so not that much older than me. Sounds like he was really keen on the regiment.
You can talk about the gardens and the glories of the graves, the Black Watch and the Seaforths, and your singing Scottish praise. Don't forget to Scotland's glory, there is yet another force that lives in songs and stories, the famous Scottish horse. For they were ranked as yeomen, and they quickly made their name, feared and honoured by the foes, and upon the roll of fame stands Tullybarden's horse and Scotland's yeoman force, the equal of the glorious praise, the famous Scottish horse. At Benson's fight near Bethel, where exploding bullets fell, and the field was filled with fallen, and it seemed a living hell, there was no thought of surrender to that overwhelming force, for surrender is unknown to the famous Scottish horse. In the dim and distant future, when the years have rolled away, and your prattling, toddling babies are all old and worn and grey, they can tell their children's children of a famous yeoman force, one Scotland's pride and glory, the famous Scottish horse. One Scotland's pride and glory, the famous Scottish horse.
One Monday of the first week in August 1914, Jimmy and I left the house at 6 a.m. with all of our provisions on our backs and climbed a hill to start another week's work on the fence. I remember the weather was warm and sunny, and incidentally, it was my 21st birthday that week, but I don't remember that I even thought about it. On the Saturday, we always packed up our tools, closed up the tent about 10 a.m. and made our way down the hill. Old Jimmy leading the way down and across the moor, making a beeline for Maggie Miller's pub, which was the first house we encountered as we entered the village. Jimmy always called in on his way home for a dram and a pint of beer. I was teetotal at the time, but I always accompanied him for a shandy. The pub was full of workmen who were with a contractor digging a pipeline to take water to Glenalmond College across the river. We were amazed to learn that war had broken out between Britain and Germany earlier that week. Actually, on my birthday, the 4th of August. At that time in my life, I don't think I ever thought about the state of nations or politics. This news of war was a shock to me. I was eager to be on my way to get more news after hearing all the discussions and rumours of war. We had 3 miles to go to reach home. I remember Jimmy walking along at his steady pace, smoking his clay pipe. I was itching to get back to the digs. Jimmy never varied his pace. He got there just the same. When I got to the digs, I had a meal and a clean-up, took my bike and set off for Perth, 10 miles away. I saw the Black Watch marching out their barracks and down to the station. I think it was the first time I'd ever seen a battalion on the march. I went up the hill with Jimmy the following Monday morning to put in another week's work on the fence. Of course, we had no news of the war. No one came near us during the week. I think I was making my mind up. I would join the army. Well, I was young, and it was a great adventure. As we made our way home at the end of the week, I saw the Kitchener poster asking for 500,000 men. This was the first of the famous posters to come out, and it was just what was needed to give me the urge to join up. The weekend was spent mostly talking with friends about the war and joining up. There were 2 regiments of the Scottish Horse at the time, and they were in camp training at Blair Athol. When the 3rd regiment was raised, some of us thought this was just what we'd like. And the thought of a horse to ride appealed to me. On the Monday morning, I went along to the estate sawmill in the wood where I'd previously worked to see if any of the others would join me to Dunkeld. The foreman came up from Scone with a letter he read out, saying that
Lord Mansfield wished it to be known that in the event of any of his unmarried employees answering the call to arms in this hour of Britain's danger, his situation would be kept open for him.
Well, this decided us. 4 others joined me to Dunkeld. We walked down to Lunchty Station and took the train to Burnham.
The Scottish Horse was originally raised in South Africa in 1900, and in 1901 a regiment of 4 squadrons was raised under the command of the Marquis of Tullybarden, afterwards the Duke of Atholl. Later, Lord Tullybarden raised a 2nd regiment, consisting of Scotsmen from home and Australians of Scottish descent. The 2 regiments served with distinction in the South African campaign, and in 1902 the Scottish Horse was disbanded, the Boer War being ended. Then, in 1903, the Scottish Horse Yeomanry was reformed as a cavalry unit. The 1st Regiment was raised in Perthshire, the 2nd in Aberdeenshire, Elgin, Nairn and Argyllshire. And recruitment was aimed at keepers and stalkers, with special emphasis on scouting and the use of the rifle.
We all passed the doctor as being fit and duly signed on for 3 years or duration of war. We were then sent home to settle our digs and to pack up our goods and chattels. The next morning, we left for Dunkeld again. And old Jess was weeping some when we bade her goodbye. I think we'd been good lodgers for her, and I must say that I enjoyed my year's stay with her and Geordie. Arriving at Burnham, we made our way to the camp, which was in the field beside the Tay, near the little Clachan of Inver, where Neil Gow, the famous fiddler, was born and lived all his life. On the way from Burnham, I met a lad of about my age who'd got off the train with us. He and I became close friends. He'd been a groom and later a chauffeur, so it wasn't difficult for him to decide what to join. Like many others, he didn't survive the war and was killed in Greece in 1917.
Until 1914, the 1st and 2nd Regiments did their training at Blair Athol or here at Dunkeld and Burnham. Both camps offered exceptional opportunities for extended mountain training in wide open spaces of moorland and hill.
At the camp, there may have been about 200 men, some in uniform, others, like ourselves, in civilian clothes. There was a line of tents, but not enough for all. For a few nights, we slept in an open shed, some under the trees, as the weather was good. It was 3 weeks before we were issued with our uniforms. Every day, men were streaming into the camp, and in a few days, the 3rd Regiment, the Scottish Horse, was at full strength. We were moved down to Scone Racecourse, where we had more room to start our training. There was a wide expanse of grass parkland stretching towards the Tay, ideal for drilling with horses. Our instructors were old soldiers, mostly South African veterans, who put us through our drills of forming fours, marching, and later, rifle drill. Soon, we were given a horse to look after. I think most of us enjoyed this part of the training. I enjoyed the mounted drill, and we often found it great fun, as we were all mostly young, and it was a great adventure. Every day, we were learning something new about soldiering, and in a month or more of intensive training, we were beginning to look like a well-trained regiment. I think we were beginning to feel proud of the 3rd Scottish Horse.
The Scottish Horse had an association with this very building, well, the original Institute building through the wall there. And they crop up in the minutes right through from 1914 to 1918. The minutes show that the Institute was in constant use during the war by local people, military personnel, and those concerned with wartime activities. There was a reading room offering books, newspapers and magazines, as well as a library, refreshment room and ladies' room. Rooms were hired for parties, dances or clubs, for get-togethers, but the facilities most used were the baths and the billiard table. Here's an entry from September 1914. September the 14th.
The Secretary intimated that Lieutenant Haven of the Scottish Horse had taken over the Institute buildings as from the 1st of August in the name of the military authorities as billet quarters for the Scottish Horse.
It goes on to say that the caretaker and his wife resigned due to pressure of work, due to the
military authorities placing so many men in the Institute to be fed.
Committee members tried to persuade them to stay, but they left, having removed their furniture from the Institute and no one being left in charge. Captain Nielsen of the Army Service Corps promised to have the men removed from the building by Monday the 21st of September, and that only the hall and lavatories would be used. There are repeated references to the state of the billiard table, its condition deteriorating as the months went by until an entry from September 1916.
If the Scottish Horse are to be billeted in the area during the winter, then the billiard table should be reserved for members only from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m.
When war was declared on Germany on the 4th of August 1914, recruiting was opened at once, and within 48 hours the two regiments enlisted sufficient men to complete the establishment and replace any men found medically unfit. Within 8 days of war being declared, the two regiments went into camp at Scone, and the 3rd Regiment was raised in a matter of days. These 3 regiments formed the 1st Scottish Horse Mounted Brigade and very soon left for England.
Have you done your duty? Mothers of Scotland, have you placed the swords in your loved ones' hands and sent them out to do battle? Have you wished them Godspeed with smiles on your lips? Your sisters in France, your sisters in Belgium have done their part, and they're still doing it. Like the ancient women of Greece and Rome, they have found themselves possessed of indomitable pluck. Go, my Alphonse, go. I will not say ye nay. Go for the honour of our country. Thus urges the Frenchwoman. The smile that lights up her dark eyes is cradled in tears, but she keeps on smiling. Babette of Brittany is a great patriot, and she loves her beautiful France dearly. As for the Belgian woman, whom Scotland reverences for her wonderful qualities, she does not say much. She is a doer. First and foremost, I will go to fight these German brutes, urges her husband. Yes, and I will go with you to help load your gun, my heart, replies his wife. And you know it's true. You have read of the splendid bravery shown by the Belgian women. You have heard how they load the guns and how they feed their men, standing side by side with them in the trenches. But have you ever wondered how they must suffer when they see their loved ones cut down? Mothers of Scotland, have you realised this? your son. He wants to join the Black Watch, but you hold him back. I need him at home, you say. Or perhaps I'm afraid to lose him. Your husband, he suggests that perhaps he should be off too. But you cry and you beg and you implore him to think of you. Do you ever think of the other mothers who've had to sacrifice their ewe lambs? Perhaps their Benjamin to the greed of the German cannon. Do you ever think of the other wives who weep for the touch of the vanished hands? Do you girls who use all your smiles to keep your lad from enlisting ever think of the thousands of other lasses who are tearing their hearts out at home? Perhaps for the boy who will never return. Look to the future. How can you answer your children's questions? Why didn't Daddy go if you keep him by your side now? Are you listening, mothers of Scotland? I want to hear your answer. Yes, I know how you feel. I know what you will say. Scotland ever! And Glen and Strath will witness many a sorrowful parting. We'll see many an anguish-torn heart. But, like the Belgian and the French women, you will have done your part. You cannot go into the trenches, but you have bred men whose bones are like iron and whose muscles are of steel. The men of the Black Watch, the Gordons, the Seaforths, the Camerons, and many other Scottish regiments owe their backbone to the way they have been reared. A mighty cry has gone forth from your sisters on the continent, and it's reached your heart. In ever-increasing volume, I hear the tramp of men. I hear the skirl of the pipes. I see eager, youthful figures wending their way to the nearest recruiting office, while fading into the mist of the glens are tear-stained but happy faces. The faces of the left behind. It shall never be said that Scotland shirked. The mothers will see to that. Aunt Kate, People's Journal.
At the end of October, we boarded a train with all our horses and equipment and went off to Kettering, stopping at appointed stations to feed and water the horses and also to get a cup of tea. After 3 weeks, we were sent to Newcastle on the East Coast defences after Scarborough was shelled by a German destroyer. We were given cavalry drill near Morpeth, drilling in bigger and bigger formations. Of course, as it turned out, this was to be of little use to us when we did go into active service. But it was good discipline, and we enjoyed it. We spent Christmas 1914 there, and were given Christmas dinner of pheasant and plum pudding. When spring came, we were under canvas again, taking part in manoeuvres and field days around the surrounding countryside. Then followed a period of spit and polish before we were reviewed by Lord Kitchener and the King. We had a long wait before they rode past the saluting base. Our horses were very restless before we rode past the King in troop formation. At the end of the summer, 1915, we heard that we were to be sent to Egypt, and that we would leave our horses in England and have remounts waiting for us there. We were issued with khaki drill uniform and pith helmet and took a train to Devonport. When the train stopped en route in Exeter, we were given such a great send-off, with ladies and older men coming along the train, giving us bags of buns and chocolate with a card inside from the mayor and mayoress of Exeter and committee, wishing us good luck.
On the 17th of August 1915, the 1st Brigade embarked on HMT Transylvania under the Marquis of Tully-Barden, who had been appointed Brigadier General, and set sail for the Mediterranean. Their destination was not known, but on leaving Malta, instructions were issued that the brigade would be equipped with web equipment and proceed to Mudros, where they would transship and sail to Gallipoli as an infantry brigade. The 2,100 men on board ship were re-equipped in about 12 hours, and all the cavalry equipment was packaged for storage at Alexandria.
Our food was very poor. Thin porridge served on tin plates, tea in a tin mug. We sailed along the Med in glorious sunshine, calling in at Gibraltar one evening to pick up supplies and mail. It was after sailing from Malta. We were told our destination was not Egypt. We were being sent to Gallipoli.
They are rare boys, do or dare boys, and a few boys, good and true boys. Frae frozen mountains to Egypt's hot sands, Tully-Barden's go ahead, gallop at his command. Oh, here's to the health, oh young Tully-Barden, chieftain o' the forts. Here's to success for Tully-Barden's gallant Scottish horse. Regard foreign boasters and their cafes and bars, whose only scent of battle pisses smoke from their cigars, and champagne corks, the only shells that they'll know. Oh, you best tell our enemies, these lads fear no foe. Oh, here's to the health, oh young Tully-Barden, chieftain o' the forts. Here's to success for Tully-Barden's gallant Scottish horse. Here's to the Aussies, the colonials ye ken, wha rode by our side the finest body o' men. Oh, the won't be denied, boys, who'd pass any test. Let us sing loud o' Hamilton and Watson and the rest. Oh, here's to the health, oh young Tully-Barden, chieftain o' the forts. Here's to success for Tully-Barden's gallant Scottish horse. They are rare boys, do or dare boys, and a few boys, good and true boys. Frae frozen mountains To Egypt's hot sands, Tullibandon's go ahead, gallant at his command. Oh, here stay the health, oh young Tullibandon, chieftain o' the force. Here's the success for Tullibandon's gallant Scottish horse. Gallant Scottish horse.
For Britain's sake, do something. The air is electric with excitement. Enthusiasm blazes. Gallant lads in khaki, hundreds of sturdy fellows are marching down the street through shouting, cheering crowds. Off to the front. The thrill of it fires every watcher's heart. But see, yonder, at the corner stands a youth whose face is glum and wistful. He is bent-shouldered. He's speckled, undersized. The story in his face is pain for everyone to read. How he longs to be marching to the music of the band with all those splendid lads, marching on to honourable death, glorious victory. If only he was of decent physique, he would be stepping along, pack and blanket strapped to his back, as proudly as any of them. No such luck for him. The army doctors refuse him kindly, but firmly. There is nothing for him but to stay at home with the women and children. No wonder he looks glum. If these lines should meet his eyes and those of thousands of young people like him, this is the message one would give him. Cheer up. There's plenty of work for you to do. At home, you haven't got time to mope. We can't all fight for Britain in the death-leaking trenches, but there is a task for each of us. Anyone with eyes in his head and determination in his heart can find something to do for his country. If you can't enlist, you can at least care for the comfort of those who do. If you can't spare money for the great relief funds, well, perhaps you can give your services in the organising or clerical or collecting work connected with them. Do something, because if you don't, you will regret it bitterly in the years to come, when men talk of these tremendous days and ask you what you did for Britain. If you cannot die bravely at the front, you can at least live bravely at home, routing the dismal doubters, comforting the poor folk who are hard hit by the awful ravages of this unexampled war, doing your own little bit to cheer up Britain, facing your own inevitable hardships, cheerfully and patiently. Do that, and you need not turn away ashamed when the boys come marching home again. Cheerfulness is a virtue. Patience is often a finer thing than contempt of death. See that you show them both.
Mr. James Cuthbert, joiner, Cathedral Street, Dunkeld, has received a letter from the chaplain stating that his son, Private McLaren Cuthbert, 7th Gordon Highlanders, has been killed in action.
Before enlisting, Private Cuthbert served his time as a gardener at Dunkeld Gardens. He enlisted after the outbreak of war and is the first Dunkeld man to lay down his life for his country.
On the 31st of August, the brigade transshipped to 2 smaller vessels for conveyance to Suvla Bay.
One evening, we were loaded onto flat-bottomed boats called lighters, and we sailed for Suvla Bay, arriving before daylight. As we approached the beach, we could hear bursts of machine gun fire and rifle fire, with occasional shells landing all along the line. We could see star shells lighting up the sky. There was this sickly, unforgettable smell wafting off the shore, which we later found to be always there. We landed on shore behind a steep cliff which sheltered us from the view of the Turks on the hills. And we waited till daybreak.
With daylight, the Turkish guns opened fire at once. Speedily, the units were moved to what little shelter was available, but the Turks continued to take their toll during the day. Medical officers and stretcher bearers were kept busy, particularly in the 1st and 3rd regiments.
An enemy plane came over, and no doubt saw us on the beach. In a short time, shrapnel shells were bursting on top of the cliff and caused our first casualties. Our Sergeant Cook was killed by the first salvo as he was supervising breakfast. After that, we hugged the cliff more closely. An Australian soldier sat beside us, tall and wiry, with a relaxed attitude. He was typical of the Anzacs we were to later see in Egypt.
For the first 2 or 3 nights, the brigade was employed making a reserve line of trenches, moving out at night and returning to their bivouacs at daybreak, until the trenches were sufficiently advanced to be occupied. There were no dugouts, neither room or material was available, just a trench which was deep enough to give a certain amount of protection, as long as you remembered not to stand up.
As darkness fell, we marched over to behind a line of trenches held by the English yeomanry and were told to dig in by morning. We'd barely got the trench deep enough when daylight came. The sun brought out hordes of flies to torment us. Rations were mostly Frey Bentos tins of bully beef and biscuits. Water was more or less rationed, had to be brought up from the beach where it had been landed by the supply ships. The Turks were maybe 200 yards in front of us, but when we arrived, the English seemed very jittery. A corporal gave us a few details of what happened to them since they landed. They'd had a bad time, with many casualties. When it was dark, we crawled out in front of the digging party and took positions within whispering distance of each other. Corporal was on my right, my friend Geordie Fraser was on my left, with his brother Jimmy on his left. The orders were that in the event of being attacked, we were to retire to the trench and not shoot before retiring. To keep awake, we passed the words, "All's well, along the line at intervals. It was very difficult to keep awake, staring into the darkness. We'd had very little sleep for 2 nights. I must have dozed off a little. I heard Geordie Fraser calling out in a hoarse whisper. There was movement in front of us. Turned to see a Turk on one knee, ready to throw a bomb into the trench. We opened fire, but I don't know if we did any damage. The Turks retreated very quickly. Our regiment came up the communication trench later that day and took over from the yeomanry. Sentries were posted, and we gradually got organised. All the time, sporadic rifle fire was coming over the trench. Sentries were using periscopes to keep a lookout. We landed with only limited kit, so we just had the essential commodities: soap, towel, razor, toothbrush, spare shirt, socks, mess tin, knife, fork, spoon, blanket, and ground sheet. During the first few days in the trench, when we weren't on sentry duty, we kept busy digging latrines and dugouts. At night there was little rest and only room to lie down on the fire step of the sentry you'd relieved. Bully beef was quite unpalatable. When we opened the tin, it was just a greasy mess with the heat of the sun, which also brought out millions of flies, repeating for every bite we ate. They swarmed on the latrines and on the dead bodies in no man's land.
Dysentery began to take its toll on all ranks, and the doctors didn't seem to take it very seriously and prescribed medicine and duty, M&D as it was known. Not a very popular prescription. Ultimately, some got so weak they had to be sent to the hospital ships lying offshore.
We were all generally low health after the long sea voyage with crowded conditions and poor feeding. We'd had no rest since the landing. We also began to get infested with lice. Every morning, after stand down, we'd take off our shirts and try to thin them out, but it was a losing battle. They multiplied too quickly. With the lice disturbing our rest at night, flies giving no peace during the day, life in the trenches was grim.
Every night, they were digging saps out towards the Turks in order to reach higher ground and advance the line. The Turks had the hills behind them, and so they were difficult to see. The brigade, on the other hand, was silhouetted against the sea and was easily picked off, with many casualties.
There were lots of corpses lying near where we dug in. I think I counted 19 Yorkshire yeomanry, their faces blackened with only their teeth showing. The Turks had taken off their boots. Letters and photographs lay strewn on the ground beside them. We covered them with the lime that we were using for the latrines because we couldn't bury them at the time. We were now quite near the Turks and could sometimes hear their voices. Our sentries had to be very cautious not to be silhouetted against the sea, as the Turks would crawl up and pick off a sentry that was careless. They would take up a position and wait on a target for hours. All night, machine gun and rifle fire were being exchanged. We got so used to it we didn't pay much attention. We didn't get much news of the war in France, but news came through that there had been a great victory at the Battle of Loos. We were ordered by the High Command to give a great cheer. I had very little to cheer about, though I didn't know it at the time. My brother Jim had been wounded in the Battle of Loos, along with many thousands of other casualties. The Battle of Loos was a very doubtful victory.
As the days passed, the numbers of sick and wounded being sent to the hospital ships left the brigade with fewer and fewer men to do duty. Sentries had difficulty staying awake at night, and later an order came out that every man should have a complete night's rest every 4th night.
Some of our officers were good, some not so good. Mr. McLean was a grand man. He was always cool and encouraging. One night, I'd come off sentry duty and had just got off to sleep when Sergeant Fitzpatrick shook me up and whispered that a sentry had been shot and would I help to bury him before daylight. Now, I was getting pretty weak with bouts of dysentery and just feeling tired and in need of a rest. But as our numbers were getting fewer every day, I just had to help out. I can't be sure of the name of the sentry, but I think it was McLennan. He'd been shot through the head and must have died instantly. My companion and I carried him in a blanket down the communications trench to a hollow behind our line. I remember my trousers were soaked in his blood as I was at his head. I'd always been fit. I couldn't believe that I could be so weak, not able to dig as I used to. Then we must have both been pretty weak. It took a long time, lots of rests, before we dug the grave deep enough. Lieutenant McLean was with us all the time. And when we laid the body in the grave, he asked us to sit one on either side of him with our backs to the enemy lines. We then drew a blanket around us before he lit a candle. He opened his Bible, read the burial service very reverently, and afterwards said a prayer. We covered up the body, and the officer erected a wooden cross which he prepared. All this time, machine gun and rifle fire could be heard all along the line, as it did at all times, day and night. Ultimately, I was the only one left of my section of 8 men. As the weather became colder, we got dressed in our heavier uniforms and forgot what a torment the flies had been when we landed. Towards the end of November, we were relieved in the front line by the Lovett Scouts and took up positions in the reserve trenches to support them. We'd been in the trenches continuously for 3 months. It seemed to be a case of survival of the fittest. Rumours were going around that we were to evacuate the peninsula. We didn't pay much attention to them. Folks at home would send parcels sometimes, socks or tins of sardines maybe, which we'd share with a friend.
Every letter from the front refers to the soldiers' need for tobacco. You can get neither a decent cigarette nor a respectable fill out here, states one of the most recent postcards received by the editor from the continent. The editor thanks his readers for their past generosity and asks them to come once more to the risk. Each week he is dispatching large quantities of the fragrant weed, but he wishes to do more. Tobacco, as you know, is a soldier's best friend during active service. It sustains him in long, weary marches, and when he lies with a bullet in his body, it soothes his pain. Now, do something for our heroes. Send a pipe, a bit of tobacco, or a packet of cigarettes, or all of these, and as many of them as you can afford. And the editor will see to it that they reach those who have proved themselves worthy of your kindness. Of course, if you have not the time or inclination to purchase a pipe or tobacco, then send the money and it will be devoted to that purpose and certainly expended to the best possible advantage. Mark your parcels or letters Tobacco Fund. But again, the knitting of socks, belts, and the numerous other articles which tend to the comforts of those exposed to all sorts of weather may appeal more strongly to you than providing of tobacco. If so, get busy with the knitting needles, for socks, belts, cuffs, or even shirts are urgently required by our men taking part in this battle of the nations. People's Journal readers have responded magnificently to those weekly appeals on behalf of our brave soldiers, and there should be no slacking off of energy, but rather an increase of activity, seeing that the cold weather is rapidly approaching. Address your parcels to Editor, People's Journal, National Relief Fund, 8 Bank Street, Dundee.
Still time for your gift. Soldiers need many comforts. Are you helping? There's still time for you to send along a gift for a soldier if you have not done so. And if you have already contributed, why it may be of no great hardship to send another. Our soldiers on the battlefield need every comfort they can obtain. From the People's Journal, Clothing Fund and Tobacco Fund, huge consignments of goods have been dispatched, but we want to do still more.
Sergeant W.S. Watson, 3rd Battalion, the Coldstream Guards, wrote,
I wish to thank you most heartily for your gifts. We're having it a bit rough out here.
Private James Taylor, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, said,
It is with great pleasure I send this card thanking you sincerely for your gifts. I can assure you I am very pleased with them. Please thank your readers who helped to provide the gifts.
Seaforth High Association Club, Edinburgh. The Editor, People's Journal. Dear Sir, you will be pleased to know that I have had an answer to my inquiry regarding the parcels which you dispatched for the Seaforths on active service abroad. The parcels have all been received and much appreciated by the men. I am, etc., R.P. Hodge, Honorary Secretary and Treasurer.
No sum of money is too small. If you cannot spare a shilling, send 3-penny stamps. They will suffice, although you may not believe it, to provide more than 2 ounces of tobacco for a man on the battlefield. Address your parcels to Editor, People's Journal, National Relief Fund, 8 Bank Street, Dundee.
On the evening of the 26th of November, there was a sudden thunderstorm with a deluge of rain, which took everyone by surprise.
The rain was coming down in torrents, began to pour into the trench. Suddenly, a rush of water came down through the trench, flooding everything. We were soaked to the skin. Jimmy managed to get out. I wasn't fit to move till Jimmy hauled me out. We got an issue of rum and a cup of tea somehow. As the day wore on, it became much colder. Frosty wind brought snow. Ground froze. So did our overcoats. Our feet were numb. As darkness fell, Jimmy, his brother Geordie, and myself huddled together in the corner. Our frozen overcoats were like clay boards on us. I was at the end of my endurance.
Sickness played worse havoc than ever. Hospital ships were continually moving in and out of harbour at this period, often 2 a day, and tremendous difficulty was experienced in getting the sick on board.
I was put on sick parade. As our party made its way to hospital, many others were struggling on the beach, and the Turks sent a few shells to help us on our way. I was taken to the RAMC Marquee. An orderly helped me in. I remember waking up and being offered a cup of boiled rice. As darkness came down, the doctor came round and said,
"Now, all you men will parade in time to go back in line with the ration party tonight."
He looked at me and said,
"Are you all right?"
I said I didn't know.
"Well, you look all right. Parade with the rest of the party."
I must have been pretty helpless, as the orderly went for another doctor, who looked at me and said,
"Do you think you can get along to the embarkation station and get on the hospital boat?"
Of course I could manage. I could hardly walk. I took a lot of rests and chummed up with a 5 and 4 for yeomanry man who was in much the same state as I was. We eventually got aboard the hospital ship as daylight was breaking and were given a cup of coffee and a sandwich. A great treat. We hadn't tasted bread in weeks. It's difficult to believe, but I slept all the way to Egypt. The weather had cleared up, and I don't remember sailing from Suvla Bay. But I'd often gazed longingly at the hospital ship from that trench, thought about all the comforts there if one wasn't in pain, but I never thought I'd experience a voyage in one.
The evacuation of Gallipoli began. The following description of the evacuation is contained in a letter from Lord Tullybarden to his father, dated Christmas Eve, 1915.
My available force dwindled down to 502 at once, as we all expected to get the signal sooner than we did. And for 10 days, these 502 men or less hung on. There we were, one thin line, day and night, within shouting distance of the enemy. Only 400 men for 1,400 yards. No support behind us. Then on the night of the 19th and 20th of December, we started the final stage and got rid, as soon as it was dark, first of all of the 136 men in the 3rd Regiment who slipped back silently in the dark along the maze of trenches, pits and mines to Suvla to embark. Then at 22:30 hours, I slid back with all but 50 of the remainder. We got there without mishap, straight onto a lighter and then onto a ship. We were then anxious as to the fate of the 25 men of the 1st Regiment and the 25 men of the 2nd Regiment, whom we had left behind with orders to keep the fun going until 01:30 hours. They arrived, breathless and happy, and were packed on board, all safe. The real fun came the morning after the evacuation. We heard that the Turks, reinforced by German artillery and officers, were going to really go for us. And sure enough, it came. But unfortunately, the day after we left, they must have been sick.
4 officers and 82 other ranks were killed or died of their wounds. 129 other ranks were wounded.
After a spell in hospital in Egypt, I was eventually sent home. We disembarked at Southampton and were taken to hospital in Bristol, where I stayed for about 3 weeks before being given a 10-day leave pass. I remember being on a tram car on my way to the station when an oldish lady sitting opposite said,
I see you are from over the border with your blue bonnet.
my Scottish horse bonnet, which I'd worn when I came off Suvla. I told her I was on my way home, and she took me to the station and saw me aboard my train. It was a long journey, and my father was waiting for me with the dog car. I was home, happy to see the old place again and enjoy the comforts of home. My mother, my sister, Mary, and John, who I think must have still been at school. My brother Jim was back in France after being sent back wounded from Loos. And my younger brother Geordie was training at Bridgeverne with a Black Watch. After 10 days leave, I went to Dunkeld and reported to the doctor. He looked at my record, sent me home again for another month, so I just did an about turn and went home again. I came back to Dunkeld after this leave sometime in March 1916. Found many old friends who'd been invalided from Gallipoli. We were billeted in empty houses in Dunkeld, and after a week or 10 days, one morning on parade, the officer asked for volunteers to rejoin the regiment in Egypt. I was standing beside Bob Gordon, who'd been in my section in Gallipoli, and I said, "Come on, Bob, let's go." "No," said Bob, "I'll never volunteer again." Well, I returned to Egypt, and Bob was drafted into the Black Watch along with the others and killed in the Somme, 1917. His pal Jimmy Wallace was killed with him.
In February 1916, the brigade was absorbed into the 1st Dismounted Brigade on Suez Canal defences. After various duties, making trenches and roads and fighting the Turks to drive them back across the Sinai, the regiments returned to Cairo. Then, in September 1916, the Scottish Horse Yeomanry became the 13th Battalion of the Black Watch. They were sent to France in June 1918 and ended the war there.
Well, that was William Mowatt's tale. Maybe some of you have heard it before. It certainly stands up to the retelling. Afterwards, as Ruth said, he lived in Walkmill at Stormontfield, where he operated the ferry across the Tay between Stormontfield and Lunkerty, and did so for many years, even after the Second World War. Amazing! The majority of our narrator's lines were taken from a short review of the Scottish Horse Yeomanry, compiled by Paul Aitchison Wigmore. Other characters were mostly taken from the People's Journal publication published in Dundee during World War I. We've added some songs, writing set to music, connected to the Scottish horse. Craig Herbertson adapted J.M.W. Campbell's Boer war poem, The Famous Scottish Horse, and Tom McEwen adapted Tully Barden's Scottish Horse from various writings in 1902. Our final song was collected in 1944 from many different groups of soldiers in Italy. This version most associated with both Hamish Henderson and Harry Pym. And the Scottish horse, Well, there's another tale and a half. We've not enough time left to tell you all, and some of it still sits in the archive, waiting to be investigated. That's your cue. Maybe you can help Ruth with that. Meanwhile, here is some of what we've found.
With the Second War, we split into two regiments, the 79th and 80th Medium Regiments, now in the Royal Artillery. After Dunkirk, we joined the 1st Division to guard the Lincolnshire coast and to train. Our first practice shot sank an RAF target moored off Mablethorpe. The RAF had said,
"This target was not to be used under any circumstances."
but the CRA said,
Oh, let them. They'll never hit it.
that shot also took off the feathers of every chicken in that peaceful farmyard. The farmer said he'd prefer the Hun to us and our monstrous cannon.
The 79th were at D-Day, and you all know what that entailed. The 80th sailed round the Cape and ended up in North Africa before invading Sicily. They faced several D-Days of their own: Trino, Sangro, Svero, Anzio. At Anzio, in January 1944, they fought non-stop for a month as Hitler tried to drive them back into the sea. At great cost, they finally consolidated the beachhead, and as the Germans retreated to prepare for the next battles, they had earned a brief respite.
In March, a bunch of our lads teamed up with the pipe and drums from the other regiments and entertained the wounded in the hospitals. Not sure how much the Yanks appreciated that. Well, maybe some of them did. The Anzio Beachhead Pipe Band. When the breakout started, our guns gave continuous support, but there wasn't time to dig in our batteries position. The ground was as hard as Sauchiehall Street. We were heavily shelled and suffered 15 casualties. But the breakout was successful, and within a couple of days, we were in Rome.
An intelligence officer named Henderson had set it up for the pipers to play at the Anzio Hospital. He also decided that the liberation of Rome shouldn't be just down to the Yanks. After knockbacks from Seaforths and the Royal Scottish Fusiliers, he came to Scottish Horse with a bus he had somehow commandeered and persuaded an officer called Dingwall to authorise him to take the massed pipes and drums into Rome first.
What a day that was. Flowers, kisses, shouts of Scozzezzi as we marched up the Albano Road and onto the Piazza Venezia. Didn't stop there. The next day, we played dozens of places all over Rome, and Movie Tone filmed us in front of St. Peter's. Before we knew it, we were on the radio, the BBC no less. All 5 Scottish regiments and the Enniskills. After a full year of battle, we had a month or so of respite. A chance to remember our many lost comrades. A chance to repair. You had to laugh when we heard that they were calling us D-Day Dodgers in the papers back home. We knew from our mates in the 79th how bad Normandy was. When you look back at the hell that was Monte Cassino, Anzio, Sicily, Tripoli, soon the lads were all making up verses to the tune of Lily Marlene.
Some of the verses don't bear repeating in polite company. but we found a few to fit on the back of your programme so you can sing along.
We're the D-Day Dodgers off in Italy, always on the vino, always on the spree. 8th Army scroungers and their tanks, we live in Rome among the Yanks. We are the D-Day Dodgers, way out in Italy. We landed in Salerno, a holiday with pay. The Jerry's brought the bands out to greet us on the way. Showed us the sights and gave us tea. We all sang songs, the beer was free. To welcome D-Day Dodgers to sunny Italy. Naples and Casino were taken in our stride. We didn't go to fight there, we just went for the ride. Anzio and Sangro were just names, we only went to look for dames. The artful D-Day Dodgers, way out in Italy. Dear Lady Astor, you think you're mighty hot, standing on your platform, talking Tommy Rot. You're England's sweetheart and her pride. We think you're mouth to bleeding wine. We are the D-Day Dodgers, with sunny Italy. Look around the mountains in the mud and rain. You'll find the scattered crosses, some that have no name. Heartbreak and toil and suffering gone, the boys beneath them slumber on. They are the D-Day Dodgers who stay in Italy. They are